Welcome to Awake Us Now with Pastor Chris Dodge. Our program is sponsored by Awake Us Now. We have a heart to see awakening in America. Revelation is a study many of you have been asking for, so here's Pastor with today's teaching on Revelation.
We have moved into Revelation chapter 8, and we're taking a look at the vision that the Lord Jesus gave John of 7 trumpets. It continues into Revelation chapter 9 and Revelation 10 as well. And as we've been discussing, these visions that John saw on the island of Patmos nearly 2,000 years ago are visions that have been widely interpreted by believers over the centuries. Wide differences in understanding and in application. The normal response to that is to say, well, who's right and who's wrong? But what we've been proposing all along in this study is that it may not be a case of who's right and who's wrong, but instead it comes back to a fundamental truth, and that is that God is all-knowing, God is brilliant, and He is the one who has put together this revelation for John and for us so that it applies in every age and in every time. As we look at the vision of the 7 trumpets, we're going to be focusing once again on the way various believers, devout followers of Jesus, have interpreted these words. The preterist, one who believes that these words were basically fulfilled in the first century, and fulfilled especially with the fall of Jerusalem in 70 AD, just as Jesus had predicted. The preterist looks at the vision of the 7 trumpets and says this refers to the Jewish war of 67 to 70 AD. It shows how Jesus' prediction that Jerusalem would be destroyed and that the Jewish people who had rejected him would be scattered all over the face of the earth. The historicist, on the other hand, looks at this and says these visions refer to events that took place throughout history, specifically the invasions of the Roman Empire that began in the 400s and continues on to the conquest of the city of Constantinople in 1453. The futurist looks at these revelations and says this is referring to a 7-year period of intense suffering that will take place prior to the return of the Lord Jesus Christ. And the idealist looks at these visions and says these are pictures of catastrophes that have happened throughout history and will continue until the Lord Jesus returns. After all, he had predicted there would be wars, rumors of wars, earthquakes, famines. He said these are the beginning of birth pains. And the idealist says we have seen this throughout history, even as Jesus predicted. Today, we're going to continue looking at this vision of the 7 trumpets. And as we do that, what we are seeing is a series of angelic messages given to us, powerful messages. As we see these 7 trumpets, each of the trumpets is blown by an angel. And angelic messengers are behind everything that is going on here. I believe that is highly significant, especially in difficult times. Keep in mind, throughout the scriptures, angels have often appeared to believers. And when they do, they almost invariably begin with the same words. They begin by saying, "Fear not." Remember when the angel appeared to the shepherds in Bethlehem field at the time of the birth of Jesus? What comes out of his mouth first thing? "Fear not. I bring you good news of great joy that will be for all the people." When an angelic being appeared to individuals like Samson's mom, like Gideon, what did the angel say? "Fear not." In Hebrew, it sounds like this, Al Terah, or in the plural, Al Tiravu. It literally means, don't even imagine the things that cause you fear. Now, I believe that's highly significant for what we're going to be looking at this morning, because these are things which on their own are fearsome. But God reminds His people that He is in control. And as we saw last week, the blowing of these 7 trumpets comes in response to the prayers of God's people. God is at work here. Those who do not believe should be afraid and should be drawn to a God who loves us and is trying to call us back to Himself, even in the midst of our rebellion. Those who know and love Him are reminded, don't be afraid. In fact, don't dwell on these negative things. Concentrate on what God has promised. I love these words of the Apostle Paul to the Philippians. This is Philippians chapter 4, verse 8. This is what the Apostle writes. He says, "Finally, brothers and sisters, whatever is true, whatever is noble, whatever is right, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is admirable, if anything is excellent or praiseworthy, think about these things." And that's where we need to be in our relationship with the Lord too. We do not ignore what's going on in the world around us. These are uncertain times. There's no denying that. But we look to the goodness of God and we remember the mighty things that He has done. And we do not fall prey to becoming like a rebellious world that so often engages in violence, hostility, hatred, misbehavior, and out-and-out sin. Instead, we cling to Him who loved us, who gave His life for us, who is risen from the grave and is coming back for us. And so it's on that note that we continue now with our study of Revelation chapter 8, verse 8, with the second trumpet blast. And this is what we read. "The second angel sounded his trumpet, and something like a huge mountain, all ablaze, was thrown into the sea. A third of the sea turned into blood." That's how the second trumpet is announced. As we look at that trumpet over the centuries, variety of interpretations have come forth. The preterist view, the view that says this was all fulfilled in the first century, says that Israel is the mountain, and in effect that's being cast into the sea as judgment. The preterist looks at this and says judgment has come upon Israel, a horrific judgment because so many rejected the Messiah. If you look again at those words, verse 8, it says, "A third of the sea was turned into blood." And then in verse 9, "A third of the living creatures in the sea died, and a third of the ships were destroyed." The preterist says not only is Israel the mountain, and that picture is given, that symbol is given in the Hebrew scriptures as well, for Jerusalem, for Israel, for the Jewish people, the mountain cast into the sea, but also blood on the sea. And the preterist looks at that and says that's exactly what happened during the Jewish revolt of 66 to 70 AD. In fact, if I may quote it from the Jewish historian Josephus, who probably never read the book of Revelation, this is what Josephus tells us about the revolt that took place in Israel against the Romans, and specifically an event that occurred on the Sea of Galilee, where Jesus had ministered. This is what Josephus tells us. "When his rafts were ready, the Roman general Vespasian put on board as many troops as he thought needed to deal with the enemy out on the lake. The Jews were surrounded with no hope of escaping to land, which was all in enemy hands. If they attempted to break through the line of rafts, the Romans could reach them with their pikes and spear them, or jump onto their boats and use the sword. Anyone resurfacing from the water was immediately stopped by an arrow. All over the lake, large numbers of Jews met their death in one form or another, and many were shot down while still in the water, and many who did jump onto the land were killed by the Romans on the beach. One could see the whole lake stained with blood and full of dead bodies. Not a single man survived." The preterist looks at this and says this is describing judgment that came on God's own people, who many had rejected Messiah when he came. The historicist, on the other hand, looks at this and says this is describing the invasion of the Vandals from about 428 to 468. The Vandals came crushing down on the Roman Empire from the north. What they brought was piracy. The Romans had controlled the Mediterranean Sea for centuries. And now with the arrival of the Vandals, suddenly no one was safe on the seas. Many individuals killed, boats destroyed, vessels wrecked, and people murdered, captured, sold into slavery. The historicist looks at this and says this is describing events that occurred almost 400 years after the time of the Apostle John. The futurist, on the other hand, looks at this and says this is a picture of the false church keep in mind, the Bible talks about God bringing living water into the lives of those who believe. But polluted water, the futurist says, describes unfaithful Christianity, false belief. Some futurists even suggest that what this is describing is nuclear warfare that has an impact on the sea as well. And then finally, the idealist looks at this and says, there have been disasters at sea throughout the ages, and these are things that will continue until the return of the Lord Jesus Christ. Many individuals look at some of the great sea disasters of the 20th century, from the Titanic to warfare in the First and Second World Wars, and say these are things that are a fulfillment of the very thing that is revealed to John. John goes on then and describes what he sees next. Now a third trumpet is blown. And he writes, the third angel sounded his trumpet, and a great star, blazing like a torch, fell from the sky on a third of the rivers and on the springs of water. The name of the star is Wormwood. Now, this third trumpet blast brings a great star from the sky coming down onto the waters, onto the rivers, and it basically pollutes the rivers. And the name of the star, we're told, is Wormwood. Now, I'm using the New International Version of the Bible as we're reading here in Revelation chapter 8. But I think it's very important to note that this word wormwood is not unique to the book of Revelation. Instead, it is a word that is frequently found in the Hebrew Scriptures as well. Unfortunately, the NIV and a number of translations don't translate wormwood. They usually translate it as something that is bitter fruit and so forth. But if you look at a number of other translations, they really do capture what the Hebrew says. This is Jeremiah chapter 9, verses 15 and 16. It's from the Holman Christian Study Bible. And the Holman Bible, like the King James and a number of other versions, translates the word wormwood. This is what we read. Jeremiah is given this word from God as the ancient nation of Judah has rebelled against God, is bringing judgment on itself, and God announces, here's what's going to happen because you have not listened to me. Therefore, Jeremiah writes, this is what the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, says. I'm about to feed this people wormwood, and to give them poisonous water to drink. I will scatter them among the nations that they and their fathers have not known. The use of the word wormwood in Revelation chapter 8 is an allusion to what we read in the Hebrew Scriptures. And by the way, not just in Jeremiah 9. It occurs several other places in the Old Testament Scriptures, and it always refers to God bringing judgment on his people. And it's for that reason that the preterist looks at this and says, this is talking about judgment on Israel, that God is bringing judgment on them and he will scatter them throughout the nations, something that we know did indeed take place after the revolt against Rome. The historicist, on the other hand, looks at this and says, this is obviously describing the onslaught of Attila the Hun, who was known as the scourge of God, who brought judgment on an empire that was crumbling. And Attila the Hun, one of the things that we know about him is that he especially invaded the area of the rivers, like the Danube, the Rhine River. We have ancient accounts that tell us what happened as Attila brought destruction on people along the rivers. According to eyewitnesses, somewhere in the neighborhood of 300,000 died near the rivers as a result of Attila's invasion. Again, the historicist looks at this and says this has a clear connection with history centuries after John received the vision. The futurist looks at this and often says this is referring to apostate religion. Religion that has turned its back on the things of God, that's more interested in acquiring a name for itself, acquiring power, acquiring influence, basically living life on its own terms. The idealist looks at this And many idealists have said this refers to the way we have destroyed the environment that God himself created. And many idealists have said this is about the pollution of waters and destroying the very things that give life to human beings. That is the way individuals over the centuries have interpreted this third trumpet. And again, you look at this, and each one of these things are speaking about things that really have happened, do happen, are happening, and probably will happen until the return of the Lord Jesus. But they apply in every age. And so words that John was given from the Lord apply in the first century. They apply in the centuries following. They apply as we look toward the future. And they apply in every day and age. God is brilliant. Let's move forward. Verse 12. The fourth angel sounded his trumpet, and a third of the sun was struck, a third of the moon, and a third of the stars, so that a third of them turned dark. A third of the day was without light, and also a third of the night. And now we see judgment on the heavenly bodies, on the sun and the moon and the stars. And again, various people have interpreted this differently. The preterist looks at this and says, this is talking about Israel's fall and about upheaval in Rome. It is very interesting to note that when ancient Israel fell to the Romans, Rome itself almost fell. What happened is there was political upheaval of the worst kind in Rome. And the result was there were many who were fearful that the empire itself would collapse, even as Roman troops were winning a quote-unquote great victory over the people of Israel. The preterist looks at this and says, this judgment of the heavenly bodies is showing how God is bringing judgment not only on the nation of Israel, but upon the nations and upon the empire. The historicist looks at this and says this is heralding judgment on the empire of Rome in the days of Rome's collapse. In 476 AD, or in that area, the barbarian invasions finally brought an end to Roman hegemony. The city of Rome was captured, it was devastated, and it was looked upon as one of the greatest tragedies people had ever experienced. And so the historicist looks at this and says, this is showing well in advance of the actual events what is going to happen to the empire that made war against the saints of God. The futurist looks at this and says, this is talking about signs in the heavens, celestial signs that will accompany the last days and precede the coming of the Lord Jesus Christ. The futurist says there are going to be signs in the heavens, even as Jesus himself had predicted. And the idealist looks at this and says, first of all, this is talking about spiritual darkness in the last days and throughout history from the resurrection of Jesus until his return. But it's also talking about signs in the sky as well, those same celestial signs mentioned by the futurists. That too is the way it's been interpreted over the centuries. And if you look at that, you can make a defense for every one of these, I believe. And it does show how this word applies in every day, in every generation. You and I are living far closer to the return of Jesus than any generation in history. We do not know when he will return. Jesus told us no human being knows that, only the Father. But we do know this, he will return. And we can expect to see unsettled times in our day and in the days to come. And therefore, we do not fear not, Al Torah. Instead, we look to God. We trust him. We rely upon him. We do not focus all of our attention on the stuff that is destructive, but instead we focus our attention on the very promises of our God and realize nothing happens without not only his foreknowledge, but nothing happens without him using it ultimately for his glory and for our good. It may be painful, it may be difficult, but in the end, God wins, and by faith in the Lord Jesus Christ, you and I win as well. Revelation 8:13. John continues. He says, as I watched, I heard an eagle that was flying in midair call out in a loud voice, "Woe, woe, woe to the inhabitants of the earth, because of the trumpet blast about to be sounded by the other three angels." Or to put it another way, things are going to go from bad to worse. And it leads us then to the fifth trumpet blast as we move into Revelation chapter 9. Revelation 9 verse 1 says, "The fifth angel sounded his trumpet, and I saw a star that had fallen from the sky to the earth. The star was given the key to the shaft of the abyss." We read on, verse 2, "When he opened the abyss, smoke rose from it like the smoke from a gigantic furnace. The sun and sky were darkened by the smoke from the abyss. And out of the smoke, locusts came down on the earth and were given power like that of scorpions of the earth. They were told not to harm the grass of the earth or any plant or tree, but only those people who did not have the seal of God on their foreheads. They were not allowed to kill them, but only to torture them for 5 months. And the agony they suffered was like that of the sting of a scorpion when it strikes. During those days, people will seek death, but will not find it. They will long to die, but death will elude them." Now, how has that been interpreted? Well, very fascinating. First of all, the preterist looks at this and says this is describing Israel's national insanity. And let me explain what that means. If you read the eyewitness accounts of what took place in Jerusalem at the time of the Roman siege, where about 1 million people ultimately were killed by the Romans, what you will see is even in the face of an enemy that was overwhelming, what happened to the people in Jerusalem? The answer is they began making war on one another. If you read Josephus's account in the War of the Jews, it is chilling. It is so disheartening. You see people who are making war on one another, even as they're being attacked by a common enemy. What takes place is nothing short of insanity. Has that happened at other times in history? The answer is absolutely. And the preterist says what is being described here is what happened in ancient Israel as the Romans destroyed the land. The historicist looks at this and says this is a clear chronological follow-up to what has been announced by the other trumpets. And the historicist sees this as the Saracen invaders, the Muslim invaders who came out of Arabia from 612 to 763 AD. The historicist looks at this and says all of the details here fit with that Saracen invasion. And here's why. It says they come like a locust horde. What we know from biblical history is that locust hordes often came out of Arabia. A second thing you note here, it says these locusts were prevented from attacking the green plants and trees. That's what locusts always do. This is describing something other than a typical locust invasion. And for those reasons and others, the historicist says this fits perfectly with what we saw happen during the Saracen invasion. The futurist looks at this and says this is symbolic of satanic and demonic attack of the last days, when the devil will no longer be restrained. And the futurist says this is describing events yet to occur. The idealist looks at this and says this is describing the action of demonic forces throughout New Testament times and beyond into our own day, and is describing the fact that there is a spiritual war that has been waged since the Garden of Eden, but is now coming to its final moments in these last days. That is the way these visions have been interpreted, and this fifth trumpet has been understood. Again, you look at this and you can make strong arguments for each and every one of them. Perhaps the best way to look at this is not to say, which one will I choose, but rather to be in awe of God. And it's absolutely essential that God's people walk by faith.
You've been listening to Awake Us Now with Pastor Chris Dodge. Our program is sponsored by Awake Us Now. Have questions about today's message? Text or call us at 612-545-5654 or email us at mail@awakeusnow.com. And join us again next time for Pastor's continued study of the book of Revelation.